Hey, um, so you've seen the title, you know what this is about. Um, in late 2020, November, I believe, I started reading Berserk by Kentaro Miura. I had a pretty limited uh, experience reading manga when I started reading Berserk. I read Uzumaki by Junji Ito. That was the first manga I ever read when I was in my late 20s. I was working at Half Price Books. I don't know why I had always been so resistant to manga for my whole life. It just felt like I like anime, but not a lot of it. Most of it is just okay, I guess. And I don't know. I always just I always just felt like there was something about manga that felt like I don't know. There was like it was like a step too far, which is very silly for me to say now that I felt like self-conscious about it, but I did, and so I never read it because like I knew the kids who did, and I didn't want to be one of them, basically. And I wasn't one of them, and I'm still not really. The people who are really into it, you know. But I read Uzumaki, and I liked it quite a bit. I really enjoyed that, and I read some other Junji Ito stuff after that. I read Cat Diary and a couple of other like shorts and things like that. And then the next time I read manga was when they lied to us about Attack on Titan ending the show, and it wasn't actually done. And then I was just like, fuck you. I went and I read from where that was to the end, which was like, it was like 4 volumes or something. I don't remember exactly. And then I decided to read Berserk in December of 2020. So that was like before I started doing book content on this channel, even because that was in the following spring. But it was one of the things that started getting me back into reading more heavily for a little while, as long as that lasted, which was like 6 months. And I've been reading it off and on for almost 3 years now because it's quite long. It's 41 volumes that are about 200 to 250-ish pages each, I believe. So like 9,000 pages or something. Long story. And it's not done. But I caught up. I am now current with it, which is why I'm making this video. I've been wanting to make this video for a while, but haven't gotten caught up. And I would read Berserk sort of in fits and spurts. I read the first like 13 or 14 volumes of it pretty quickly in late 2020, early 2021, up through the end of the Golden Age arc, which I'm going to try and structure this video. So first I'm going to talk more generally, spoiler free, largely. Major spoilers for sure free. And then I'm going to talk more intricately in a way that will spoil plot points if you've not read Berserk. But at the end of the Golden Age arc, there's a very well-known series of events that happens that is very hard to get through, I would say, or just very dispiriting. I've talked pretty extensively on this channel about like what I was going through personally in 2020, and I was not in a super great place, and it was just really it got really hard for me to sit with a character who is so deep in the wake of something so horrible, because I've felt, largely the same, though I would say that maybe I didn't have as hard of a time as Guts does. And then I went back, finally, I picked it up sporadically, but got back into it more seriously at the end of 2022. So I put it down almost completely for like a year and a half, and then I picked it back up like in December of last year and read a good chunk of it, and then took a break, and then I just sprinted the last chunk of it recently, and now I'm done. Which is, I feel accomplished. It's the longest thing I've read in a very long time. I don't really read series that much anymore, as my taste has just changed to I don't really like high fantasy that much. And whenever I've tried reading series in recent years, I've not been able to get all the way through them. I read the first 2 Expanse books and enjoyed them, but I don't think I'm ever going to read more of them. I don't know, it's just not for me. I don't know. But I want to say up front that Berserk is one of the greatest things that I've ever read. I think it would be hard for me to say definitively, this is the best thing. But it might be. It might be. It's definitely one of the pieces of art that has had the most emotional impact upon me, that I have felt, close to the most sort of resonance, spiritual resonance. Just, it is a text that is incredibly empathetic. And it demands that empathy back from you. It demands you enter into a parasocial relationship with its characters that allows you to see yourself and the people that you have loved and the people that you have lost reflected back to you by the text itself. And I don't think that there is a greater achievement that a piece of art can accomplish than that. And it is one of, if not the best examples of it that I've ever experienced. And I'm no slouch. I don't read quite as voraciously as a lot of people who read seriously do, but I have seen a lot of movies, movies and music are kind of more my bread and butter, I think. I love books, of course, and I love writing. It's all kind of a Venn diagram in my mind, but I've definitely seen a lot of movies, more than most people, and listened to a lot of music. So I wanted to say that up at the top, just as a way of really emphasizing how serious I am when I say that you should read Berserk. If you are watching my channel, if you're familiar with what I like, if you're here because you are interested in what I have to say, what I have to say, more than anything, is that it is worth it to read this story. If you're familiar with Berserk, you might want me to expound on a caveat of, are you sure it's worth it? And if you're not familiar, I'll explain why that might be asked. So Berserk was written and drawn by the mangaka Kentaro Miura, starting in '89 when he was like 23 years old. And in the spring of 2021, this was another thing that kind of derailed me from reading it, honestly. In the spring of 2021, he died unexpectedly of a heart condition, undiagnosed heart condition. And chapter 364, the final chapter of the 41st volume, was the final completed chapter that he worked on before he died. So he died without finishing the story. And after a period of time where nobody was quite sure what was going to happen, they came out and announced that Koji Mori, who is also a manga artist, Miura's lifelong best friend, his closest confidant, would take up the reins to finish the story because he was the only person still living who knew what was going to happen. Because they collaborated a lot, they spitballed, they workshopped ideas together, and he knew where it was going. He knew all the big story beats. He knows what's going to happen. And so they've done like 7 or 8 chapters now posthumously with Koji Mori and Miura's understudies making the series. Now, obviously, this is not ideal. But do I think that this is a better option than just ending it? Yes, I do. I think that in this specific instance it is. Because of how close these two men were. If you do a little digging in, you will learn very quickly. Especially, I think the best thing, if you're curious about that, is there was a little one-shot manga that Koji Mori made after Miura died. That was a sort of little eulogy for him. That is very, very moving. And like, we go to these new chapters knowing that it's not the same. You can tell, immediately that this is not Miura drawing. You can tell the difference. But it's not bad. It's just what it is. But is it still worth it? Even though it's not done, even though it's not ever going to be finished the way it was intended to be, it's still worth it. Doesn't matter. Even if they weren't going to finish it, it's still worth it to read. Even if it had ended at the end of chapter 364, it would still have been worth reading. And it would still be worth reading now. And so also for new people are probably curious, what is Berserk about? We're 15 minutes into this video and I haven't even really talked about it. So Berserk is, I would call it a dark fantasy / horror story that centers around a character named Guts. It follows him from when he is a child throughout his life. He's an orphan. He's raised by an abusive sexual predator, forced to be a mercenary as a child soldier. He has a very bad life. And then becomes extremely strong You probably, even if you have like passing knowledge of Berserk, you're familiar with just the image of Guts in black with the big sword. That's like his thing. Once the story really gets rolling is when we get to the Golden Age arc. It revolves around Guts joining this mercenary group called the Band of the Hawk that is led by this man named Griffith, who is this sort of angelically beautiful and frighteningly powerful man who comes from nothing but has the most lofty ambitions, and he's the most charismatic person. He is capable of enacting what he calls the dream. And he is able to inspire everyone he meets to follow him with a sort of incredible devotion. He is tough, but he is also tender. He cares for his people, but he also refuses to take anything less than the best that they have to offer. And through meeting him, Guts is able to finally start to be a human being, basically. People who have experience living in elevated trauma and sort of constant environments of trauma as children can attest that, like, we learned that we have to prioritize safety over connection. And the result of this is survival, but the cost is isolation, the inability to maintain relationships with other people, and an inaccessibility to basic human happiness and fulfillment. But in the Band of the Hawk, Guts is able to find family in his comrades. He's able to learn joy. He's able to fall in love with Casca, who's the sort of right hand of Griffith. It's sort of an enemies to lovers type thing with her and Guts. They're both rivals for Griffith's affection, but ultimately are drawn to one another because of all the things that they hold in common. And it's a really beautiful story about, overcoming until it's not anymore. And something which I alluded to earlier happens, which changes everything. And from there, the story becomes, if you would like to be simple about it, a story about revenge. But it is, I would say, significantly more complicated than that. And ultimately, I think, personally, it is not a story about revenge. It is a story about healing. It is a story about letting go. And it is a story about how letting yourself be vulnerable and letting yourself be loved by other people can save you. I'm sorry, I'm getting a little choked up. So, from here on, I'm going to start getting spoilery. But if you haven't read Berserk, I really cannot implore you enough that you should. So, the eclipse, if you're still here, hopefully you know what I mean. After the eclipse happens, and Guts has to watch all of that, has been betrayed by the person he believed in the most. He's had Casca taken from him in a sort of metaphorical way. Her mind is destroyed. And then now they both have been marked with the brand of sacrifice. The demons come for them constantly. There is no rest. It is such a particularly evocative metaphor, the brand of sacrifice, and just the constantly being hunted by darkness, unable to rest, unable to heal. It's a very evocative and true feeling metaphor for living in that wake of trauma. And that was the section that was the hardest for me to get through, because the despair is so heavy. It is really, really tough. But he captures that despair so evocatively, and in a way that feels like very, very true. I loved this story up through that point. But it was really when the Fellowship, for lack of a better term, begins to assemble itself, begins to kind of accumulate, that the story really, it felt like a paper orchid just sort of like opening up in the water. Because we have Puck, of course, who is the elf who gives us some much needed comic relief, often fourth wall breaking, very wonderful character, very funny. Like, the levity that he provides in a story that is this heavy is just, it's like coming up for air, a lot of the time. And it was very smart for Mira to have him there. But Isidro, he's a boy who idolizes Guts. He wants to grow up to be a great swordsman, but he's, hot-headed and doesn't listen. And it's very clear that Guts, as hard as he tries to act, sees himself as a young man in him, and he begins to mentor him. The point that I felt like the story really blossomed for me was when Shirka showed up. They wind up in the forest with the spirit tree. Shirka is a young girl who is training as a mage under the tutelage of this ancient, powerful witch who lives in the base of this spirit tree. And she and her mistress are able to craft these like wards to partially seal the brands of sacrifice on both Guts and Casca. And that moment was the first moment in so long that it felt like a burden had lightened in the story. And it was the beginning of sort of this long sort of accumulation of lightness, the burdens shedding away. There's always strife, there's always struggle, but it just continued to feel like the more characters that the core group of travelers accumulated, the more distance they made, the lighter the load was for Guts. The more he was able to accept the help of others before he could not. It's just such a beautiful representation of that process and of what it feels like to heal after something really, really horrible happens to you. I want to talk about the Elf Island chapter. Right before the end of that was when Miura passed away. There's I think it was like 5 chapters that they did after he died to end it. And he died, the last thing he finished was this very, very climactic moment. This moment of surprise that immediately preceded something really horrible happening. And it was just after we had possibly the biggest sort of relief that we've had since the eclipse. 30 volumes and 20 plus years of writing ago. When Griffith appears, when they're reunited for the first time, truly, because there's the moment after the battle at the ocean where he's fighting the Kushan king guy who turns into the big fire in the sky, and they get on the boat and Guts is totally fucked by the berserker armor, and he sees Griffith on the shore, and it's the first time he's seen him since the eclipse. That's such a wild moment. And when you look at how frequently he was publishing chapters, that was when, and he got on the boat, that was when things slowed down, a lot. That's not a new observation that I'm making. That's a pretty well-known one. And I think that there is a very intentional metaphor there. And I'm not the first person to observe that in that moment, Guts sees the source of his rage, that drives him, and he chooses to let it go. He chooses to walk away. And it felt like, Miura had been publishing very rapidly these very intricate, he worked himself to death basically for 20 years. And it feels like that was the moment when he let go of the need to finish this. Not necessarily for real, but just at the pace that he was working, because he knew that it was killing him. It was destroying him. And he reached an acceptance that he could let himself live his life. Now, the truly shitty among us wax and complain that this decision by him has led to his story being unfinished. But if that's the price for allowing this man to live and be happy for the last 10, 15 years of his life, I think that's a no-brainer. Because I think that people are far too invested in story, plot, which of course is the driving force of all of this, and I love it too, don't get me wrong, but the how is more important than the what. I don't think it's worth it to destroy yourself to make something great. Personally, I've loved the art of many people who have destroyed themselves to make things great. Sometimes quite literally. Many people who, even if the art doesn't destroy them, just people who are destroyed. And I would gladly give that work back if it could save them. A story, a character, never really ends, never really dies. Anybody who writes can attest that if you make a character, you write a story, those characters live beyond the scope of the story you write in your mind. And they have more stories, and you know they do, and you sometimes even know the stories. Because they are living just like us. And we have stories that begin and end, but the totality of us is a story that doesn't ever really begin or end. Because we don't remember our own beginning, and we are remembered by those we love after we are gone. And that's what Berserk is too, and that's why it doesn't matter if it's unfinished. And it doesn't matter if it had been picked back up, and why it's still worth reading either way, regardless. And why I think you could start it right now and get caught up like I did, and it's still a worthwhile pursuit, even if it's not done yet. Because there's so much being offered here beyond the what of the story. We meet these characters, we learn to love them, or we learn to despise them, some. We learn to care for them. We learn the things that they love about themselves. We learn the things that they hate about themselves. We learn their insecurities. And we see how they learn to care for themselves and each other, and grow and change and learn. And by watching them do that, we ourselves are able to do it as well. And that is the good shit, my friends. If that's not why you're here for art, then I don't know what the fuck you're doing. Like, there are certainly people who just watch Marvel, Star Wars franchises. They turn off their brain. They don't think. They have no interest in engaging with any sort of meaningful thought about their lives. And those people are dull, and they are not good companions. In order to be a great person, a great partner, a great friend, a great parent, you have to interrogate the world in a profound way. And the greatest medium, the greatest vehicle for doing this, for looking inside yourself and then through that out into the world, is art. That's why it exists. Not all of it needs to be that, but you have to have substance. And Berserk is one of the most substantive things I've ever And if that doesn't get you to fucking read it, then I don't know what will. I know it's really long, but like, I don't know. Check it out of the library. That's what I did, at least for partially. I did eventually fall back on to my phone, but just put it on hold of the library. Give it a read. See how you like it. I will say, it's extremely violent. There is a lot of sexual violence in it. But if you struggle with that, if that's a thing that you don't want to see, because this is a comic book, if you do not want to see sexual violence, then you should not read this story. And I'm sorry, it's just the way it is. But it is a beautiful, beautiful thing, regardless. I don't know. Well, I think that's pretty much all I've got to say. Just that this was a great read. Underselling it there at the end, but yeah.